All right, I think we are live. So welcome back everyone to quarantine baking, hurrah, hurrah. Kind of another gloomy day here, but that's perfect for staying in the house and making some treats. So yeah, today we're going to be making a classic French pastry dough called Pate Choux. Hello Cameo, thanks for coming. So maybe you've heard of Pate Choux before, maybe you haven't, but it's basically the dough that we use to make eclairs, profiteroles, croquembouche, Paris-Brest, lots of classic French pastries. And then you can also do a savory version with some herbs and some cheese, and they are just like really nice, beautiful, light cheese puffs. So it's a pretty versatile dough. There's no chemical leaveners in it at all. It's 100% leavened by steam, which is pretty cool. But what that means is that we're gonna need to really get the moisture content right in it. It's generally pretty easy to put together and everything, so don't be intimidated, but I'm happy to get the chance to show you guys kind of what we're looking for as we go along. And then just because we can't only have dough with nothing to fill it, we're also going to make some pastry cream today, which is basically just a fancy word for pudding. And you guys can flavor this however you want. I included an adjustment in the recipe for making it chocolate, if you like that. But you can also add liqueur. Frangelico is really nice, like Cointreau or orange liqueur is really great. If you have different extracts that you want to throw in there, aside from vanilla, you know, coconut or maple or anything like that, feel free to get creative. You can also infuse like orange zest or even nuts into your milk and cream, or tea as well, if you infuse that and just let it steep for a while, and then you can strain out whatever you use to infuse the flavor. It's pretty versatile, and it'll taste really great either way. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing today. So I think the best place for us to start, I'm going to go ahead and teach you guys how to do something called craqueline, which if you have seen like different Instagram posts or maybe even on the Food Network or something, a lot of times eclairs or cream puffs will have kind of like a crackly layer on top. And this is just a very, very simple sugar dough, but it's pretty great. It helps the dough itself bake up more evenly. It kind of like gives it a shape to follow, which is really helpful. And it adds a nice textural element. You can color the crackling if you want, and it's just kind of a nice addition to give you like a really clean looking end product. So we're gonna make that dough and then get it chilling, and then we're gonna make our pastry cream and get that chilling, and then we're going to get our pate choux made and in the oven. And it'll take probably 20 to 30 minutes to bake. We want a really good golden brown on it. One of the classic mistakes that people make with this is thinking that it's done, and you know, because it has a nice golden brown, but you actually want it to dry out a fair amount on the outside. The inside should stay pretty moist, but it will collapse in on itself since the only thing holding it up or making it expand at all is steam. It traps that moisture, and you bake it longer than you might expect, is basically what I'm trying to say in so many words. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into some crackling. I've got a little different setup today because we're doing a lot of work at the stove, so hopefully all of these angles will work for you guys. So let me start by showing you, I have some flour here. I have brown sugar, and I just added a sprinkle of kosher salt just because I like that flavor. You don't have to do that. And then I've got my softened butter here. And I'll just pull up the recipe quickly. What we're making right now is the crackling dough on the right side there. So it's a very simple recipe, only 3 ingredients. But I think that this is a really nice addition for what we want to do. So you're gonna mix it just like a cookie dough. It's very simple. You are just gonna take your butter, and my butter is nice and soft, it's room temperature, and get that in your mixing bowl. If you don't have a KitchenAid, this works fine with a mixing bowl and then your egg beaters. And to your butter, we're gonna add the brown sugar and then salt if you're using it. We're gonna start with those things together. This process is called creaming. So if you see in your recipes something that says cream together butter and sugar, that means that you're using a paddle attachment or those kind of like thicker egg beaters. We're not trying to whip a bunch of air into it, we're just trying to soften and then mix together the sugar and the butter into a really nice uniform texture. You can use creaming to add some air if you go for quite a while. You'll notice your butter and sugar get really, really light in color and really soft and fluffy. There are some cookie doughs that benefit from that, certainly some cake batters that benefit from that as well. For this mixture, we're mostly just looking to combine everything. So I'm gonna take and scrape this down, but I'll just show you where we're getting started here. You can see the butter and sugar kind of combining, but I still have a lot stuck to my beater here. So I'm going to scrape that into the bowl and just make sure everything's really well incorporated. I just want a good mix, and then we're going to add the flour. And this dough can keep, we'll probably have some left over from this. We're gonna roll it out pretty thin to top our eclairs. But it will keep for forever basically in the freezer. And you know, it's a simple kind of wafer dough, so you can put it on top of lots of baked goodies to add a little extra crunch. Great, so that looks good. I'll just show you guys real quick. You can see it's all pretty well combined in here. It's, you know, it's soft, it's fluffy, but it's not pale. I haven't whipped any air into it or anything. And now we're gonna add the flour. You can kind of just dump the flour in. Don't worry about sifting it or anything. We're gonna form a dough here and we're gonna roll it out. Just be careful not to turn your mixer on really high. You may wanna fold your flour in with a spatula first, otherwise it's gonna go flying on you. Some of the hand mixers and even sometimes the KitchenAids, even their first speed is really aggressive. And we're just trying to kind of like gently combine this until all of the flour is hydrated with the butter. It forms a dough, and then we're gonna stop because we're not looking to develop gluten. We want it to stay nice and short and kind of crumbly. So you can see it's kind of starting to hydrate the flour and stuff there. but it still hasn't really formed a dough, so I'm just gonna scrape it and then let it go a little bit longer. We're almost there. Sometimes your butter gets stuck to the side of the bowl or up under where the paddle hits, and you just gotta scrape that back into your mix. Make sure that you get it all mixed together. Okay. All right. So at this point, I don't have like a uniform ball of dough yet, but it is hydrated enough to where it's gonna stick. So, you know, if I pick the dough up, I can form a ball that will stay together, and that is plenty mixed at this point. So, I'm gonna bring it over here. Come back up here so you can see. And now we're going to chill it. It needs to chill before we can really add it over top of our cream puffs or our eclairs. So we're gonna flatten it out really thin between a couple sheets of parchment and throw it in the fridge. So let me grab my parchment here. Got 2 sheets, and just gonna tilt this down. And yeah, I'm just kind of taking this crumbly, but it will definitely stick together. And you can even kind of crumble it out. It's just the texture of a short dough, like if you've ever made a sweet crust for a tart, or a pie or something like that, you know, that has a high sugar content and a pretty high butter content. That's just the texture that we're looking for. Get it all scraped out here. And then, because we are using like ingredients, I am just going to reuse this mixer bowl for our pate choux. So it doesn't even need a rinse. The pate choux has butter, it has flour, and it has sugar going into it. So I'm just kind of gonna clear off any chunks, and then the rest is gonna be good to go. All right. I'll kind of rinse off my paddle a little bit before I use it again, but the bowl will be fine. So I'm just gonna kind of press this together now. And then I'm gonna place another sheet of parchment on top and just roll it out. I'm gonna start by kind of pressing it out here. We wanna get it really nice and thin, like maybe 1/8 of an inch. You don't want it to be too thick or it will suffocate the pate choux as it bakes. But we do want a nice thin crispy layer. Okay, so instead of rolling it like this way, I'm just kind of pushing it out towards the edges. And that's going to kind of help get a more even spread. It's going to want to stick to the parchment, so if I try doing it this way, I'm probably going to end up with kind of an edge over here. I just want to try and get it evenly thinned out here. And this is a step where if you're making eclairs or something, you don't have to do this. I think it makes a nice, more polished product, and it adds a nice textural element. So I'm showing you how to do it, but it is not necessary. Don't feel like, you know, if you do want to make a batch of cream puffs for folks, and this feels like it's just going to be one step too many, you don't need to do this. Your eclairs will be very delightful and delicious and bake up great without this step. So I just happen to like it. Okay, so I think we're pretty even here, and it's pretty thin, which is good. I don't know if you can see how thin that is, but that's about the thickness that we're going for here. And I'm just gonna set this in the fridge to chill while we move on to the next step. So the next step is going to be the pastry cream. And the pastry cream will take a little bit, but we don't have to totally babysit it. So we can probably also start working on the pate choux once the pastry cream is off and running. And the reason we're doing the pastry cream now is because it does need to cool before we can really use it. It won't pipe if it's too warm, and it's also just not going to taste as good until after it's cooled. It's one of those products that like really needs that chilling time before it will taste the way that you want, before we're drawing out all of those nuanced flavors from the cooking process. So we are going to start there. So I have all of my pastry cream ingredients ready. This is my milk and my cream both together. And I have sugar number 1 ready to go with that. And then egg yolks. Hopefully you saved your whites if you want to make the flourless cake tomorrow. That takes more whites than it does yolks, so it'll be handy to have those on hand from this. And then sugar and cornstarch, which we're going to mix together, and some butter. The butter is going to come in at the end along with the vanilla, so you can set those aside for now. And I'll just pull the recipe up really quick so you guys can take a look. Oh, I guess I left it highlighted, but what can you do? So yeah, you can see it's, you know, it's a pretty basic recipe, kind of what you might expect for a pudding like this. You know, you have your milk and cream, some sugar, some eggs, some cornstarch. The butter is going to help with the texture and the richness, and then vanilla. It's a pretty classic thing, but it is a really nice filling for this, and you can use it in a lot of different places too. This would be a great filling if you want to make a classic Boston cream cake or pie that usually gets filled with pastry cream. You can throw it into a pie shell or a tart shell and top it with fresh fruit. You can serve it as its own dessert. Odds are you're going to have some left over. This will make, well, I mean, I have a quart of liquid here, so it'll make a little bit more than a quart of pudding. And if that doesn't all end up in cream puffs, then you're probably going to have some left over. And it's great, it's delicious on its own, but you can also use it to fill a lot of different products. So get creative with that. And yeah, the first step here is going to be to bring your liquid, your cream and your milk, and sugar number 1, which is the larger amount, to a simmer, not a boil, in the pot. So over here, I'm going to turn my heat on to like medium and pour in the cream here, and then add in my sugar. And I'll just give it a stir. Make sure it all gets hydrated. And then we can move to the next step. So the next step after that is going to be to combine your yolks and your sugar and your cornstarch and whip them to what is called the ribbon stage. I don't know if you have ever done this before, but it's similar to when you make a meringue with egg whites. You know, they go through kind of a transformative process as those proteins are being activated. So with meringue, you go from, you know, foamy to soft peaks, medium peaks, stiff peaks. They dry out a lot if you keep going. And egg yolks will do something similar. They'll get kind of foamy, and then as they get more air incorporated into them, they will expand probably about 3 times the size of the original volume. And they'll get super, super pale, a very pale yellow. And they should come off of your whip in like a ribbon formation that doesn't sink back into itself immediately. So that's kind of what we're looking for, and I'll show you that. And it does take a couple of minutes to do it, so we'll get it going while our cream is getting ready to go over here. And I have another bowl for this. I'm just gonna add my yolks in. And it took me, the 10 each was kind of an estimation. Yolks are a little different. I think it took me 11 yolks total to get to the right weight, but this, if it's the difference of like half an ounce, this recipe will turn out either way. So, and then I'm gonna take a small bowl here. I put the yolks and the cornstarch over here, and this time we're going to use a whisk attachment instead of a paddle to really get these whipped up. Start out a little bit slow so that all of the sugar and the cornstarch get hydrated with the yolk, and then you can crank the speed up. I'm just going to give my cream a little stir here. You just want to keep an eye on it, make sure that the bottom isn't scorching. It's also why you heat it over medium heat. You don't want to get it too hot too soon. I don't know if you can see the whites are already, or the yolks rather, already getting lighter in color and growing in volume. To show you, we're actually already pretty close to the ribbon stage, and that's because of the cornstarch in this mix, but it's running off pretty slowly, and it leaves kind of like a ribbon trail in there. Generally, if you're just whipping yolks and sugar, it'll take as long as 10 minutes to kind of get to that stage, but the cornstarch is helping with that thickening process. And I'm just gonna scrape the sides of my bowl here so that I know everything is getting mixed in. And I'm gonna throw it back on. And this is another thing that you can do if you don't have a stand-up mixer. You can whisk this with egg beaters, no problem. the rest of the whisking is going to be done by hand. So yeah, just you'll use the tools that you have available. And then, so this is good to go over here. It's really nice and thick, running off in a ribbon, and that's what recipes mean when they say ribbon stage. You can see what a pale yellow that is compared to the kind of bright orange that the yolks were before. Okay, get rid of this beater. And as soon as our cream is a little bit warmer, we're going to temper it into this yolk mixture over here. And so that process is really simple. It's basically where we just add a little bit of the hot milk mixture to the yolks while we're moving them around. And what that does is it slowly brings up the temperature of the yolks, which are much colder than the cream, so that you don't get like scrambled eggs and it doesn't end up cooking everything the second that it touches. You know, if we just dumped all of the cream in there, it would basically look like egg drop soup. You would have chunks of floating egg yolk everywhere, and it'd be a really unpleasant texture for pudding. So that is what we are avoiding by tempering slowly. Okay, so you can see, I think it'll show, there's a lot of steam starting to come up from the cream, which means it's just about to simmer, and that is basically scalded, which is the temperature that we're looking for. You don't want your cream to boil. It will foam up really high really quickly, and you will just have a huge mess on your hands. Trust me, I've done it many times. So this is the point where we are going to pull the cream, and I'm going to just grab a little trivet here and show you the tempering process. So I'll switch back over to this camera. And so I have my cream and I have my yolks. I'm gonna take my spatula and set it aside for a second, and switch back to a whisk. And so what you wanna do here, you can use a ladle to kind of like slowly add in your liquid here. And we're just gonna slowly add it in a little bit at a time and stir it from the second that hot liquid touches. And that's gonna keep your eggs from turning into scrambled eggs. This part requires a little bit of coordination, which I am generally very short on, but if I can do it, then you can do it. You can stick a damp towel under your bowl to help it stay in one place without twisting around on you. And then what you want to do is add about half of the amount of hot cream to your yolk mixture here, and you should be able to feel it warming up as you touch the sides of the bowl. It should feel like it's getting warm. And then once you've got about half of that in there, you can add the rest in. And I'm actually going to transfer this to a different bowl, a heat-proof bowl, so that I can put it on a double boiler and continue the cooking process. So this is about how much it's going to make. You can see that's, that's a fair amount of liquid here. It will cook down a little bit, so no worries there if you're panicking about having too much. I mean, too much pudding is kind of a good problem to have, if you ask me, but maybe you don't agree. So hang on to your whisk, but you can go ahead and use your spatula to make sure that you get all of these bits out here. And I'm just going to pour this into a bowl. You need a pretty good sized bowl. If you want to make a half batch of this too, that's fine. But, I'm always going for broke when it comes to the pastry fillings. Gotta get your fix. This is cream puffs. You don't want to be short on the amount of cream puffs. All right. So we've got that in there. I'm going to take my whisk and then I'm going to pop it over onto the double boiler. So we're going back to the stove. And so just a few notes on a double boiler or a bain-marie. If you've seen that in recipes, that's the French name for it, basically. You don't need a ton of water, just enough so that it's not all going to evaporate in the time that you are cooking this. So I've got probably like an inch or an inch and a half of water at the bottom of my pot. You don't need your heat on super high, and you don't need it to, you don't need your pot to be as large as the whole bowl. You want to cover a good amount of the surface area of the bottom of the bowl, just so you get like nice even heating. But we're also going to be whisking this as it goes along. So, and pastry cream is a pretty forgiving custard in that at this point it's going to start getting like kind of lumpy and chunky and coming together in that way, but that's what it's supposed to do. And as we whisk it, that texture is really going to smooth out. So we shouldn't have any like scrambled egg bits or anything like that in there, which as I'm looking at this, it looks nice and smooth. If you're worried about that, you can use a fine mesh strainer before you get to this point in it. You can pour it through a strainer if you think you got your eggs tempered a little too hot or something and you want to strain some of that stuff out, or if you had infusions in there and you want to strain them out now, that's totally fine. But after this point, we shouldn't really need to strain it. It should just come together to be the texture that we want. And yeah, we don't need to sit here and babysit this though. This is probably going to take a few minutes to get to the right texture, which is all that we're looking for. You don't necessarily need to cook this to a specific temperature. It just needs to come to the right thickness that we want it. But yeah, at this point we are ready to start making the dough for the pâte à choux, which is going to be a really simple thing for us to do. So I'm just going to rinse out the pot that I used for the cream. It's, this pâte à choux dough has butter in it, it has dairy. I'm just going to give it a quick rinse. You don't need to worry about like sanitizing it. If you have a different pot that you want to use, that's great. But just like that is fine. And then for pâte à choux, basically this happens in a couple of stages. So we start by bringing to a boil, and a proper boil, water, butter, the salt, and the sugar. And the butter will melt in that process. It'll just be like, kind of a soup. And to that, we are going to add our flour all at once. You're just going to dump it in, and we're going to start kind of beating it with a wooden spoon. So I have this guy. You can use a rubber spatula as well. This is like the classic French way of doing it, and some people are sticklers about that. I am not, but since I have this, I'm going to use it. And basically we're going to cook that for a couple of minutes until the flour is like really hydrated and cooked, and it'll come together like a dough, and it should fall off of this spoon without being like sticky. It should fall off just in clumps. And at that point, we're going to transfer it to the mixer, or you can use egg beaters if they have a really low speed setting. You don't want this to be like a fast speed. Or you can even do it by hand with just a rubber spatula. All you're doing is kind of like keeping it moving. We're basically tempering eggs into this dough as well. And you just have to keep it moving until everything is incorporated. And then you're good to go. It's a really simple, like pretty forgiving dough. So, eclairs are kind of a fancy dessert in their end product, but a lot, the things that go into making them are actually pretty simple and straightforward, and something that I think translates well between cooking and baking. You still need to have exact measurements for this type of stuff, but if you're comfortable working on a stove, then this is something you can definitely handle. We're only going to use the oven once today in this whole process, and that's just going to be to bake the pâte choux at the end of this process. And that's going to be like a very simple thing. I'm going to show you the color to look for and all of that stuff. And with the oven in mind, make sure that your oven is preheating at this point. If you're baking along with me, you want it to be set to like 375 or 380 degrees for these. So a little hotter than like what we would normally do for a cake or something. We want kind of a rapid release of steam, and we also want some good color on the outside of these. So we're using a little higher heat. So let's pop down here, and I'm going to, in my pot, add my water, my salt, there's salt, my sugar, and if you're making gougères, which is the savory, like cheese puff version of this, you just won't have sugar or vanilla. You'll still add the salt and the butter. And then when we start adding in the eggs is when you would like start putting in like cheese, different herbs, things that will make those a really nice savory thing. And then I've also got my butter here, and I just kind of cubed it up so that it will melt quickly. And we're going to add this whole kit and caboodle straight to the stove. And I'm just going to turn this on to kind of a medium-high heat. Like I say, we want this to come up to a full boil. So, we want the butter to melt and the sugar and the salt to dissolve, but I want it to boil. So have your flour at the ready. Don't wait to measure your flour for this one until the last second. Otherwise, you're going to lose too much moisture while this boils off. You want to have your flour ready to go in right as this starts to boil. And I'm over here taking a look at our pastry cream. It's looking foamy, but still pretty loose. It's not starting to thicken up just yet. That's okay. Turn my heat up just slightly on that. and we'll let that melt. So we're getting the butter melting here. You can see that's starting to melt. We've still got a little ways to go before that boils, but it'll happen pretty rapidly when it does happen. Again, the steam coming off here is a good indicator that's going to happen soon. I'm starting to feel a little bit of resistance over here on the pastry cream. So that's good. I'll show you when it starts to really thicken up kind of how that looks. But yeah, our butter is almost melted. And then right before this starts to boil, I'm gonna add just a little dash of vanilla. The vanilla is not required, it's just kind of nice. But the reason I don't add it right at the beginning is because I don't want all of that flavor to just cook out right away. So I'm just gonna add like, I don't know, maybe half a teaspoon here right before it starts to boil. It'll get incorporated, then I'm gonna dump my flour in, and that'll kind of be the order of operations there. Yeah, getting really close here. And then when I do add the flour in, I am going to lower the heat on this. I don't want to burn the flour to the bottom of the pan. So I'm at like 6 out of 10 right now, and I'm gonna lower it to like 3. I still want to keep it hot and keep it cooking, but I don't want to have burnt, singed flour. So we're just about to boil. I'm gonna drop in just a touch of that vanilla. Get that incorporated. Obviously, I'm making the sweet version here. I almost made a batch of gougères in addition to the sweet ones, but I just ran out of time this morning. I decided to squeeze in a run in anticipation of of eating probably too many of these cream puffs. So yeah, so we're just about boiling here. Got lots of bubbling going on, but it's not quite at a rolling boil, and that's where I want it before I dump my flour in. So I'm just gonna give it another 10 or 15 seconds. Give the pastry cream a stir. You can make pastry cream just in a pot too. I just kind of like to do it with this double boiler because you don't have to sit and babysit it. You know, it actually, you can come back and forth and work on other projects like this. You can just multitask a little bit, which is preferable to me. It like comes in handy when I'm at work. All right. Come on, let's get there. It's like watching paint dry or grass grow, which is probably something we can all relate to right now. Trista asked what kind of vanilla I'm using. It is like Valnium. It's a Mexican vanilla, which is actually my favorite, is Mexican vanilla. You see it Madagascar. Okay, this is good to go. So I'm gonna turn my heat down and dump all my flour in. But yeah, you'll see vanilla from like lots of different places. And Mexico is the only place that vanilla is actually native to. Everywhere else, it was brought over by colonizers, basically. And once I get this going and I have a few minutes, I can talk a little bit about that, because it's a pretty interesting history. So you can see this is already coming together into a dough, but I still have like some dry pockets. I'm just moving it around, feeding it with a spoon. It's really coming together. I want to make sure I don't have any like clumpy flour bits. Get those all incorporated. The dough will really start to thicken up. That's good. This is a non-stick pan, but if you're using like a stainless pan, you might notice it starts to kind of form a skin on the bottom of the pan. That's okay. Just make sure that it doesn't burn. But that's totally normal for that to happen, and it's fine. And we're just about there. At this point, it is the right consistency. You can see I can pick it up and just drop it off of my spoon. It's not really like sticking. It comes off in chunks like that. But you do want to continue cooking it for just a minute to get those starches cooked out. There's just something about raw flour and a taste that it'll bring with it. This is gonna bake again, but just to get that starch cooked, it's gonna help with the texture, the consistency, and the flavor. All right, so at this point we're good. What we're going to do is put this into our mixer bowl, which I have over here. Was saved from the crackling dough. You can just dump it in. Non-stick is very nice. It just comes right out. And then we're using the paddle attachment again, and we're gonna pop this on the mixer on low speed. Again, if you're doing this with egg beaters or by hand, that's totally fine. You just want to start moving your dough around. It's going to start to like gently cool off in this process. And we do want some amount of gluten development for this dough. We need it to hold up as that steam expands out of it. You know, we want it to kind of hold a shape and have a structure on the inside. So, you know, we're not afraid of developing some gluten in this process. All right, so I can kind of show you here. I've got like hot steam. So I've got chunks coming up as I'm stirring this now. And that's good. We're getting some good movement on the pastry cream. I'm just stirring those into the mix and keeping that together. It's gonna thicken. It's starting to get nice and thick now. It'll start moving a little bit quicker at this point. Good. Okay. Let that keep going. And then I'm going to come back to my pâte choux over here. So I have my eggs, and I'm just going to add them one at a time, and let each egg get fully incorporated. And you'll see the texture change as you add them. So right now I have that lumpy, clumpy dough. I'm just gonna add my first egg. And it'll take a second to incorporate. And if you're doing this by hand, you know, you might have to kind of like break it up a little bit. You can also whisk your eggs to help break them up if you're doing this by hand. Yeah, you just want it to get fully incorporated before you add the next one. And I'm just gonna keep showing you how it changes. So we've still got a pretty clumpy dough at this point, but it is more hydrated. It's a little wetter and a little stickier. So you can see it's kind of like sticking to the paddle. It's not coming off in that smooth clump like it did with the wooden spoon. Okay. Keep it moving. I'm gonna add my second egg. Show you what this looks like. The texture is changing a lot. So you can see it's really starting to smooth out. It's kind of sticking to the sides. And we're almost getting like a batter. Almost. It's still thick, but it'll almost come off more in like running off instead of dropping off in clumps. So now we're adding the third egg. Just going to keep whisking the pastry cream every so often. I'll show you what this looks like. Now that 3 out of 4 eggs is incorporated here. It's really a lot more uniform. You know, you can see it kind of like pulling up almost like a batter. It's still pretty thick, and we want it a little thinner than that. This is a small amount of dough though, so each egg is going to make a really big difference. And I'm just going to scrape everything, get up underneath, make sure that I'm getting a nice even mix. That's a really vital step in all baking. If you're making mixes like cakes or cookies, batters, make sure that you're scraping down the sides of your bowl, scraping down the bottom of your bowl. There's nothing worse than when you go to pour like a beautiful cake batter into your pan and you find a huge clump of dry ingredients down at the bottom. That is terrible and will just kind of ruin your day. So don't let that happen. Okay, and now I'm going to add my 4th egg. And as that's incorporating, I'm starting to see like tracks in the batter, and it's starting to smooth out. We're getting some shine, which is what we're looking for. We want like a nice, smooth, still very thick batter, but you know, we don't want it to be super liquidy, and we don't want it to be clumpy anymore. I'm just going to give it a scrape, but I want to show you guys here. I don't know if that shine is translating, but it should look shiny, like as it's smoothing out, and you can see it's like a proper batter now. You know, it's running off as opposed to just falling off. So that is what you're looking for. I'm gonna scrape the sides and put it on for a few more seconds, and then this dough is ready to pipe. This is something that we wanna make sure when we pipe it, it's still warm. It shouldn't be super hot right now. It should be like fine for us to pour into a piping bag and start working with. But we don't want it to completely cool off before we pipe it. You can chill it afterwards 100%, but you still want it at least a little bit warm for piping. So I'll bring this over here, and so depending on what you want to do with your batch of pâte choux, whether you want eclairs or profiteroles, kind of the cream puffs, you can do a couple of different things. For eclairs, I recommend using some sort of star tip, and the reason for that is that it just gives them a little bit more structure. The ridges on the dough as you pipe it will help solidify that kind of less stable shape of the cylinder as opposed to just kind of like a blob. So it's helpful. Eclairs will still come out fine if you just use a round tip too. And I do find that the cracklin helps with it, keeping its shape, baking up more evenly, having less like kind of weird topsy-turvy situations come out. You know, this isn't supposed to be like the world's most refined sort of looking dessert. They're a little bit rustic until you glaze them and top them and fill them, and you can really elevate them. But the choux dough itself is like a pretty rustic kind of lump of baked goodness. So, you know, you don't have to fret too much about how that works. But I will show you a couple of different piping methods. And if you are making eclairs, I think that one of the easier ways to do that is to pipe out very long strands and then freeze it and then cut it to the length that you want. You can even use like a ruler or whatever and just a paring knife and cut them. And then once they're frozen, you can pick them up and move them around and bake them. But I think that that's probably the easiest way to get like nice, straight, very even looking eclairs. I'm going to show you the classic way of piping them, but I think that if that's something you want to try out eventually, if you're dying to make eclairs, that will probably yield the most satisfactory result. So let's go ahead and angle downwards. I have a sheet tray here with a silk hat on it. You're totally welcome to use parchment. I'm using this purely because it's reusable and I can wash it. So, you know, just me trying to be a little more earth conscious during Earth Week. But parchment works just fine. And I have a couple of piping bags here. I'm going to show you with a star tip, this is also basically how you make churros as well, guys. So, you know, if you have a star tip, that will be the more traditional route for churros, except instead of being baked, those get deep fried. And then I have the round tip here for just like cream puffs. And I'm going to show you a little bit with both. So I'm going to do the little trick where I tuck some of the bag into the tip so that I don't lose a bunch of batter as I'm filling it. And this doesn't look like a ton of batter, but depending on the size that you want your cream puffs or eclairs to be, it'll make quite a few. You know, you can probably get 25 to 30 cream puffs and, you know, maybe around 15 to 20 eclairs, depending on the size. So for this first one, I'm going to show you some eclair piping. And what you want to do is keep it as flat and even as you can. You don't want to pull the batter too thin. You want to apply even pressure the entire time. I'm not piping straight up and down so much as I'm kind of laying the dough down on the mat, and then I'm going to get as clean of a break from piping as I can. So I'm starting it, and I'm just trying to keep a nice even pressure, and then I stop applying pressure completely so that I can kind of break the dough off without leaving too much of a tail. If you're not careful, it's very easy to make these look rather phallic. And if you want them a little thicker here, you can do that. You just want to apply pressure and move at the same time and as evenly as possible. So that's kind of what we're looking for. And, you know, leave a fair amount of space as you pipe them out. They are going to get both wider and taller. They're gonna puff up kind of 360 degrees, so you don't want them running into each other. I'm gonna run over and check on our pastry cream. My oven mitt. Give it a stir. Oh yeah. We are starting to thicken up really nice. So the foam is starting to dissipate. Try and tilt it a little bit so you can see. I'm starting to see some tracks in it as I whisk, which is good. It will get quite thick before it's done. And then it'll continue to thicken and set up as it chills as well. But yeah, we're starting to see some tracks. You know, it's not super liquidy. We're definitely making some headway here. So it'll be just a few more minutes on this one. Okay. Back to piping. So yeah, this is kind of what you're looking for with eclairs. You can also use a star tip to pipe round ones like profiteroles. What I recommend if you want to use a star tip for that is doing what's called a rosette. And a rosette is going to be, instead of just piping kind of like one round blob, we're going to create a ring, and then we're going to come back to the center and kind of wipe it like that. So it's got two layers to it. It's a little taller, and that's going to help get a little bit more height out of that shape and keep it from like spreading out too wide. It'll keep it a little more contained. So again, I'm kind of piping a layer out and then coming up to the top, and then just again stopping pressure kind of wiping it. I'll pipe one more of those guys here. And then I'll show you a more traditional profiterole shape, which is also going to be the shape that you should do if you want to make savory gougères, the cheese puffs. Will be this next shape that I'm going to show. All right. This isn't something that you need to have super strong piping skills to do, which is nice. It helps for eclairs for sure, if you want them to be like nice and even and straight. But the cream puffs themselves, you know, they tend to make up pretty round, and so long as you make them pretty close to the same size, you shouldn't have any trouble getting an even bake on them. Okay. And before I start on this, since we're so close on our pastry cream, I'm just going to check on it again. So now the foam has completely gone away that was sitting on top, which means that as it's continuing to cook, it'll kind of form like a little bit of a skin on top, which is fine so long as you keep checking on it every couple of minutes. That will reincorporate into the mix, no problem. So yeah, we've still got some tracks. It's still just a little bit loose for where I want it. If you like if you're just making a pudding that you want to eat out of a vessel, a bowl, or a cup or something, this is a fine point to pull it. I just am going to try to pipe with this later, so I want it a little bit thicker. I'm going to let it keep going. Okay. So back over here, got my round tip here. It's about a 1/2 inch, just like we used for the macarons. And I'm just going to, here, I'll put it closer to you so you can see. This is going to be closer to what we did with macarons. So we want to be like straight up and down. I'm kind of like setting a height, and then I'm going to apply pressure to make the dough spread as I pipe it. But I want it to be fairly tall, so you know I have my rosettes here so I can see about how tall those were. And I'm not moving the piping tip at all. I'm just applying pressure straight up and down, and that's causing the dough to spread out as I pipe it, but I'm also maintaining that height, which I want for when these bake. And then I stop applying pressure altogether, and I just give it a wipe like that. This dough, if you do end up piping like this, that's fine. You can kind of just like tuck that back down. And we are going to be putting the crackling on top, so any kind of like imperfections like that will be covered up by that crackling, which is nice. And just like macarons, I'm giving these a little extra space by piping them offset. They won't need it all, but this will also help get a nice even bake. We want good browning all the way around, because that's what's gonna hold them up and give them their structure. So I'm gonna set this over here. grab my... Pastry cream is so close. I don't know if you guys can really tell, but the tracks that I'm leaving in it are staying longer. They're, you know, they're more distinguished. Just like if you're making a meringue, you know, you can kind of see when the whites start to thicken up, you can see the tracks left by the whisk. And that's what's happening here too. It's getting a lot more pudding-like in the texture. It's very, very close here. I think just another minute or two. And then for pastry cream, the best way to cool it is to put it into a shallow pan, a wide shallow pan of some sort. So you're increasing the amount of surface area that's being exposed to the cool air, and that will cool it rapidly. And then we're also going to take plastic wrap, and it seems really weird and counterintuitive, but we're going to press it directly onto the cream. And that's because pastry cream has a tendency to form a skin, and once it's cooled, that skin is going to give like a weird texture. It's not going to reincorporate. So we press the cling film directly onto the cream. That keeps the skin from forming. And then when we go to use it later, it'll have like a nice, smooth, uniform texture. So I've got my pan ready to go for that. Okay, I think we're ready. I'm going to turn the heat off. And over here I have my butter, which I'm going to add in first. I've got it kind of cut up here. It's room temperature. If your butter is cold, that's fine. Just cut it up into smaller pieces so that it will melt okay into the pastry cream. But the cream at this point is still really nice and hot, so it should really have no trouble melting. But by adding the butter in, we're also starting to cool it. So as I get it off this pot of hot water, and I'm just gonna stir the butter in, get it all melted in there. And, you know, butter has a nice flavor. Mostly what this is doing is like really giving it a nice texture. It's gonna give it some richness and also just like a nice melt in the mouth texture, which will be really lovely in our cream puffs. Okay, so that's all melted in. And then I've got my vanilla. I think the recipe said you want like a tablespoon. Yeah, 1 to 2 tablespoons. So I'm doing a vanilla pastry cream. So I'm gonna add at least a tablespoon here. I like vanilla, I like this vanilla a lot. This was actually gifted to me by my friend Shahida, who Andy knows. On her trip to Mexico, she brought this back for me, which is really nice. Mexican vanilla really is my favorite. And I'll have to remember to talk to you guys about vanilla a little bit. I know that probably sounds very boring, but it's actually a really interesting story. So, pastry cream is done. Tastes delicious. I'm going to take my spatula here and transfer it into the pan. See if I can do this where you can see it. And if you feel like you did get some chunkies in there, like maybe your egg cooked a little bit, or you know, the texture isn't as smooth as you want it at this point, while it's still warm, you can run it through a strainer. You might have to kind of press it through with a spatula or a ladle, but it'll pull out any of those chunkies. After that, it's going to be like too thick for you to want to fuss with that. So if you need to strain it, now is the time. You can see how thick that is, right? It's not even reabsorbing right here, so it's already starting to thicken up a lot as it's cooling. And then I'm going to take my plastic wrap here, and like I said, I'm just going to press it right on top of that pastry cream. And it's not going to stick to the plastic wrap once it's cooled. The plastic wrap will just come clean off, basically. But this is going to make sure that we don't end up forming a skin. And then this is going to go into the fridge to chill. Back over to this view. So I grabbed our dough. You can see it's nice and firm now, which is great. It's just like a cookie dough. The butter in it is solidified. And I'm just going to come down here. Excuse me, I need some water. Not used to talking this much without a drink in my hand. So I'm just going to peel that top layer of parchment off. And this is what we're going to use to cover our pate choux as we bake it. So I have these round cutters here, and I'm going to look for something pretty close to the size, just a little bit smaller than the size that I piped my profiteroles. And I'm going to punch it out. And this is just going to lay right on top of those profiteroles. And when it bakes, it'll kind of like melt over and then crisp up. And it just gives it a really nice texture, a really nice look, kind of even, and I just, something about it seems to help them hold their shape too as they're baking. So it's just kind of a win-win. And if you're not using this crackling dough, go ahead and egg wash your pate choux when you bake it. That's gonna give it a nice shine, help with the color, and also help get like a nice even bake and rise. And then, let's see here. Got my handy dandy offset spatula. You can see how much I use this. So they really are handy. If you don't have one, I would recommend getting one for sure. I'm just gonna set it right over top. It doesn't need to be like fully formed around, like you don't need to shape it to the profiterole. It will melt down to that shape as it bakes in the oven. Put any crackling on these guys just so you can kind of see how they bake up. I actually ran out of eggs. I had just enough eggs to make this recipe, so I don't have egg wash, but I would still recommend egg washing these if you have it. You'll see they do bake up okay without it, but they won't be shiny and have that kind of nice veneer on them. And yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and pop these in the oven now. In they go. Set a 10-minute timer. And then the rest of this dough, I'm just kind of gonna press it back together here. Save it for the next round. And yeah, you can color this with food coloring. It's brown sugar, so you know that adds some amount of limitation as to like what color you can use. It's also going to brown in the oven as it bakes. So you know, a really pale pink or something like that isn't going to work so well, but if you wanted a bright red or orange or even like a blue or a green, you can definitely make that work. I'm just going to wrap this like so. And I'm going to store it just like this in the freezer. And it will be fine. Okay. So, back up here. Yeah, so now that our profiteroles are in the oven, our pastry cream is cooling. This is a good moment for me to talk about vanilla a little bit. So vanilla, as I mentioned, is native to Mexico and was discovered there by, I believe it was the French actually, who then, you know, were like, wow, what is this amazing, wonderful thing? Vanilla beans are actually, they come from like really beautiful flowers, and the trees that produce them are pretty delicate, and there's a type of bee in Mexico that is the only natural pollinator of vanilla anywhere in the world. So when people were bringing these plants back over to like France or, you know, eventually down to Madagascar, to all of these places to try and reproduce them and grow them there, they could grow the trees, but they would never produce fruit. They would never produce the vanilla pods. And so it was actually this small island off the coast of France. I think it was Martinique, maybe, or another one that started with an M, that there was a slave boy actually, who was working the fields, and what he did was he was just kind of like fooling around with a stick, and he scooped up some pollen from the flower of one vanilla plant and flicked it onto other ones, and by that way he actually artificially cross-pollinated these plants, and all of a sudden they started to bear fruit. And so that is a method of like manually pollinating vanilla in regions that it's not native to, that is still being used in some cases today. Like, that's how much effort goes into just producing this like really beautiful, wonderful ingredient, which is one reason why vanilla is so expensive. You know, it's kind of a delicate plant to begin with. It's only native and naturally reproduces in Mexico, like in one country in the world. Maybe some other parts of like Central and South America, but as far as I know, it's basically Mexico. And where it has been taken to other places to be artificially pollinated, much of that is still being done by hand, which is kind of crazy. They have tools and maybe in some cases even machines to help with that now, but there's a lot of manual labor that goes into just growing and harvesting vanilla beans, and then they're actually fermented in their own pod. They're not delicious or really even edible if they're not fermented. It's a lot like coffee. It's a lot like chocolate. A lot of people don't realize that some of your favorite foods are fermented. And yeah, so it's been fermented and it goes through this whole process before it's ever like shipped out as a vanilla bean that you've seen or as vanilla extract, of course. So yeah, kind of like fascinating history. This slave boy like changed the world market of vanilla forever. And I should actually look up his name and follow up with that, because he deserves recognition for that wild contribution while, you know, unfortunately living a life of indentured servitude, which is where a lot of these really gourmet, fancy products come from, unfortunately. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of like chocolate that has been harvested by slaves in Africa. You know, there's a lot of dirty, ugly stuff that happens around so many of these things that we just have access to at the grocery store. And that's why I think that it's really important to be connected to your food, to understand where it comes from, how it comes to be the way that it is at the point that you're getting it, and also like how to use it and kind of like pay the greatest respect to it that you can. That's one of the reasons that I love making food so much. You know, it's communal too, and it's a great way to share something with people. But I think that it's really important to have that connection to our food. It's our history, it's our culture. It says so much about us as human beings, and it's something that I find kind of just generally fascinating anyways. So I'm going to try to start bringing in more of the history of certain products. Like, a lot of these things have an origin story. They were created to celebrate a specific person or a specific event. But as much as I can about ingredients that I have little tidbits and things like that, I'll try and bring you those too. Because I know there's kind of a lot of otherwise dead air here. Yes, Edmund Albius. Thank you so much for looking that up, Andy. That was the boy's name who discovered how to artificially pollinate vanilla. So maybe it was Mauritius. Was that the island? I can't remember. But yeah, kind of a fascinating history there. I did a report on vanilla when I was in pastry school, actually, and I didn't know what I was in for when I started learning about it. But yeah, okay. So the one other thing that I have kind of planned for while these are baking and cooling is to make some more chocolate ganache. It's very traditional, classic to have your profiteroles or eclairs dipped in chocolate ganache or some sort of glaze. You can definitely do a powdered sugar glaze, which would just be powdered sugar and water, cream. You can use lemon juice, you can use orange juice, you can use liqueur, however you want to flavor it. And you basically just combine those things until you reach the right texture that will kind of set up. You don't want it, you want it to be pretty thick, I guess, is the goal there. But ganache is very traditional and also delicious. And it's nice to have a pop of like dark chocolate, like a little bit of bitterness coupled with the sweetness of the pastry cream and the richness of that. It's going to help balance it and cut through all of that stuff. It's also going to provide like a little different texture. We're going to have the crisp and the chew of the dough. We're going to have like the smooth custardy texture of the pastry cream, and then ganache is its own little, you know, it's like the inside of a truffle. So it's got a little bit of a chew to it, a little bit of a different texture, which will be really nice as well. My timer's going off for these profiteroles, so I'm just gonna take a quick look. They definitely need more time. I'm gonna give them another 10 minutes before I even rotate them. I just barely cracked the oven and looked inside. This is another one of those where, as much as you can, don't open the door until they are set up enough. They will fall. So I'm going to go a full 20 minutes before I even reach in and rotate my trays. They're definitely starting to puff up, and that'll be great, but we don't want to collapse them. And at this point, they're still very blonde. There's no need to rotate the trays to get even color or cooking. So they are going to stay where they are. And we are going to move on to ganache. So I just need to wash out a pan really quick. Use my trusty non-stick here. It's really important whenever you are making products with egg or cream that you don't use aluminum to cook in them, or to cook them in rather, because it will turn everything gray. There's like a chemical reaction that happens, and it'll turn everything gray and also kind of impart a little bit of a metallic flavor, which is not nice. So stainless steel is recommended if you have like a nice kind of galvanized non-stick surface. That usually works well too. And then the other thing is just to make sure that everything's really clean, because cream, egg, it'll behave differently, like maybe not what you want it to do if you're trying to get a specific effect from, if I'm trying to whip it up and I'm cooking it over a bain-marie and my bowl is dirty, and I'm not going to get my egg whites to whip at that point. But also for the flavor, these things will absorb the flavor as they're, so if I have a little crusty of garlic in here, it's going to give me like a weird kind of garlicky ganache, which is not what I'm going for. So just make sure everything's clean and not aluminum. very important. And we'll come back over to our stove view. So my basic ganache recipe is just, it's basically 4 ounces of chocolate to 3 ounces of cream. That's heavy cream. You're looking for about 30 to 33% butter fat in your cream, which if you're just buying heavy cream at the store, that's pretty much where it's going to be. There are some that go as high as like 40, and that will still work for making ganache with this recipe. It might be a little bit more prone to breaking if you overmix it or go to reheat it and reuse it, which you can still save it with some fresh cold cream, but the fat content in there will be a little more prone to wanting to separate if you agitate it too much. But yeah, I'm making a little bit larger batch. I have a couple of other plans for this ganache. So I'm doing 12 ounces of cream to a pound of chocolate, 16 ounces of chocolate. And again, I'm just gonna kind of set this over a medium heat. I don't want my cream to boil. I'm just trying to bring it up to like just a simmer or just before a simmer. If I boil it, it's gonna foam out everywhere. That's probably happened to me at like just about every job I've ever had. Somewhere along the line, the ganache boils over. You get caught up in like too many projects, and you get distracted for just long enough, and all of a sudden you have cream covering every surface within 8 feet of the pot. And it's very upsetting, especially when you're at home, because it's generally not as easy to clean that stuff up when you're at home. But you also probably don't have an endless supply of cream around. So, yeah, you probably have, 5 or 10 minutes before it starts going crazy, but it's best to keep an eye on it. I'm just gonna wash my spatula over here so that I can use it to stir my ganache too. And keep my cream from scalding. And to this ganache, I'm gonna add just maybe a tablespoon of corn syrup. If you're making a smaller batch of ganache, you can just add a teaspoon. I'm just gonna use light corn syrup, and what that does, it's totally not necessary if you don't have any corn syrup. That's fine. I didn't bother posting a recipe for it, but all that's gonna do is add a little bit of shine, a little bit of extra shine. I'm not trying to thin it out too much. I don't want to have a really runny ganache, but it will add it'll keep it a little bit shinier when the ganache eventually sets up for our glaze for the profiteroles. So that's all I'm looking for there. Over to our cream, which is starting to move around. So I'm going to cut the heat. That should be perfect. Got a lot of steam coming. It's basically just at a little simmer. I'm going to pour it into my chocolate. And if you missed the video from the first time I made ganache, basically you just pour your hot cream into your chocolate. I have these small little chips, but if you have like a big chocolate bar or something, just make sure you chop it up. Otherwise it's not going to melt. You'll have chunks. You just pour your hot cream into the chocolate and let it sit for a minute or so to kind of like heat everything up. And then we just start stirring. And you can do this with a spatula, and we'll see. I'm not going the full circumference of the bowl. At this point, I'm just sticking to the center. I'm doing it pretty gently. I don't want to splash all of my cream everywhere. I'm trying to keep it in the bowl as much as I can here. But you can see it's starting to darken up, and soon we'll be able to see the ganache actually form in the center, and it's going to keep pulling the cream into this kind of funnel that I'm making here. And then we'll have a nice smooth texture before you know it. See, it's starting to smooth out and thicken up here. And as that starts to happen, can kind of widen my stirring range. Scrape the sides, make sure that I'm getting everything incorporated here. And it's starting to form a nice thick ganache. I am going to hit this with a whisk really quick, just to be safe. You don't always have to do this, but because I used those chocolate chunks and I didn't chop them at all, I just don't want any chunky bits in here. So I'm just going to whisk it really quick to break any chunks up. And if you do find that you have some chunks in here, like, that is not a big deal. You can always set it over a double boiler to get those melted down. I don't want to overwork my ganache here, but just wanted to incorporate that. And then I'll actually add in my corn syrup while it's still nice and warm. Like I say, I'm just going to do like maybe a tablespoon or so, really not a lot. I don't want to thin it out, but this is going to help give us a nice, beautiful shine when we glaze the eclairs and profiteroles. So, there's that. Come back and scrape everything down. And this time we do want, this is a really nice texture, maybe even just a little cooler than this is where we'll want it to glaze. You know, the first time we made the ganache, we waited for it to cool so we could pipe it into the macarons. But this time we want it to still be kind of semi-liquid so that we can dip our profiteroles in here and not have to like spread it on or something like that. So we want it to be a nice glazing texture. but not too warm so that we dip it and it all just runs down the sides. We want it to kind of like set up as soon as it hits that, and then stay there with a nice, beautiful sheen. So this looks good. Let's take a look at these. Okay, they're looking good. We're starting to get some browning. You can see the ones that I didn't put any of the crackling on. So a lot of people want to pull them at this point. Don't do it. They need more time. So I'm going to stick these back in and go another 10 minutes. All right, timer's going off. Let's check these guys again. They smell really good. All right, we are getting close. So I'll show you guys this tray again. I still don't like this paleness here. I want a little more color there. The bottom is getting nice and brown. This is really the color that I'm looking for all over, is the color that I have on the bottom here. So if you're using the crackling and you're not sure when it's done, leaving one without it is a good way to gauge, like, you know, whether or not they need more time, because it can be hard to tell, because that browns a lot more than your other stuff might. So I'm gonna give them a few more minutes. Let's check this little tray too. But we have like nice, beautiful round shapes. They puffed up a lot. I think they look really good. These are just about done, actually. I think they can do I'm going to set a 2-minute timer, and then I'll pull that top tray out. So here you can see the color on these is beautiful. The round ones came out beautifully round and even looking because of that crackling that we put on top. And we've got a nice bake on our eclair shapes as well. Really happy with this. You can see the nice golden brown under here. It's really a deep golden brown, which is what you're looking for. And if you tap it, it sounds hollow. It feels really solid. It doesn't really have any give. And then just to show you the ones that didn't get the crackling on top, the color that we got on those, it is slightly paler in here, but for the most part, even between the ridges, we've got some nice color, which is what you want. And there's not really any give, definitely fully baked. And just to show you the importance of that, I'll go ahead and cut into one of these guys. Need to figure out where I put my knife. I just did a bunch of dishes, so that's okay. Can use a little knife here. I just want to show you the structure of the inside of one of these. See, we have a nice hollow cavity here. And sometimes you'll get like some more webbing on it, but this is still very soft and spongy here. You know, it's still very dough-like. It's definitely cooked and set, but it's a really soft inside texture. So even though this is crispy and dry, on the inside, it's gonna be really soft and chewy, which is exactly what we're going for. So I can show you, how we fill these guys now. So you have a couple of different options. I'll show you the option where it's cut in half like this. And then just so you can see it, I'll go ahead and show you what it's like to fill it kind of the classic way. And the way that that is done, if you take a very small piping tip like this one, or if you have like a little nail, or you can use the tines of a fork, all you're doing is creating an entryway for us to pipe in some cream. So I've just drilled in a little hole, and if you're doing an eclair, you're gonna want 2 of these. So you can come from both ends. A cream puff, you might be fine with just 1. I know some people also like to come in from the side. That's fine too. This is just gonna be less visible. And then you need a slightly larger piping tip to fill it with. So you're gonna go into that hole that you created, and you have to squeeze pretty good, and you can see how it's gone all the way through the eclair to the other side. So it's nice and full here. Sometimes if there's little holes, it'll kind of like come out the top like that. That's good, you know that it's totally full. And if you have a little excess right here, you can just wipe it on the edge of a bowl. And then from there, you take your ganache or your glaze. Mine's starting to set up just a little bit here, but I think it'll be liquidy enough for us to dip these. A little softer is good, but this should work fine. You definitely don't want it super, super runny, because then it's just gonna run off. And you just take it and dip it down in here. You can kind of shake it so that you get that excess to run off, and give it a quick wipe right on the edge of the bowl. And then we have this beautiful glazed eclair here. And that'll go just like that. Pretty simple stuff. So you can go through and poke little holes and pipe in your cream if that's the way you want to do it. Very classic, authentic way. Another option is this guy where we cut it in half. And my recommendation is that if you did cut it in half, to dip this after you've filled it, and then you can just plop it right on top. So I have my other bag. I've got a little different tip on here. Just, I was thinking maybe I would do a little flourish as we do this one. Let me see if I can get it in the camera so you can actually watch what I'm doing. But basically, you're just gonna pipe it in like this. And you can get quite a bit of cream doing it this way too. So, you know, just be aware that this might be a little bit heavier than the filling in this one. And then we're gonna take our little lid guy over here, give him a dip, just like we did with the eclair. And again, kind of shake off the excess so it doesn't just run down and make a mess. And then once that settles a little bit, should have a nice shine to it. And we can just pop his lid on. You don't need to press too much, especially if you're using like a decorative tip and you want to maintain some texture. Normally I would use a star tip for a round one, but this was the tip that I already had equipped on here. And if you have like little sprinkles or edible beads or anything that you want to add over top, I found some funny ones in my pantry here, so I was thinking maybe I would just do a couple of little fun elements here. But yeah, before the chocolate is totally set up, you can add on some little sprinkles and they'll stick, and then as that ganache sets, they should stay pretty easily. And that, my friends, is how you make profiteroles, eclairs. We have our nice crackling on top, and plenty of pastry cream, vanilla pudding left over for other purposes. All right, well, that's just what I wanted to show you guys, and thanks again for joining me, and I will catch you at the next one.